Oh, yeah, that's very good. Who is Russian speaking here? Okay, that's a sizable. К сожалению, не буду говорить по-русски. Я стирал свой Kindle, свои русские книги на стиральной машине. И поэтому больше не мог готовиться к русскому языку. И, yeah, but we can perhaps have a chat later on. I think this will be mostly English. Who is Spanish speaking? French? Nobody's in French here. Chinese? One Chinese? What else do we have? German? Hi, German, yeah, good. Hungarian. Yes, Hungarian, good. And Serbian? Did I miss some languages? Romanian, okay, wow. Italian, okay. Polish, oh gosh, I mean, this is a whole list of languages. And everybody speaks, understands kind of English? Okay, good. Yeah, I think this is a very important question. I mean, what's the language that we use in our research? Because, of course, with language, there's so many traditions and ways of thinking, ways of doing, and we can't really translate very easily from one language to the other. And I thought, as a kind of introduction to this workshop here, I was going to present something about discourse studies, the field of discourse studies, to give you some sort of idea about what discourse studies is. And yeah, of course, there's so many backgrounds that it's very difficult to really mention all the different strands and orientations. In your view, what is discourse studies? Perhaps we can collect a few ideas and see how it fits together. How would you define discourse studies from your backgrounds? Anybody would like to go for? Mm-hmm. Okay. Other attempts, other ideas?
Well, at least I will try to summarize it somehow. I guess discourse analysis studies how language is used for some particular purposes, depending on a particular field. They might be different, but in general, it's just like focus on the use of language.
Okay, yeah. That's a pretty general definition already. Other ideas, suggestions? What is discourse studies? Mm-hmm. We can also include images, yeah, of course, yeah. All kinds of resources that we use in order to produce meanings. I think in discourse, yeah. You mean there's a question, a dimension of critique, kind of power dimensions that we can uncover and criticize? Okay. Yeah. I guess there's some idea today of what is discourse studies, and that's a quite recent development, because for a long time discourse studies was extremely dispersed in different chapels and different strands and groups. And I think for the last about 10, 20 years, there's an increasing understanding of what is discourse studies in a more global setting across languages. And I think in DiscourseNet, we've come to an understanding of discourse as the study of meaning and the social production of meaning at the intersection of language and society. That's a very, very general definition. And I think over time, DiscourseNet is one of the signs of that global field that is in the making of people studying the uses of language in the social political contexts, with a critical dimension, sometimes at least, and with the idea that meaning making is constitutive for society. So it's not only something that people do to express something, to do something, but it is at the very heart of what society is about. So I don't want to talk that much about what discourse studies is, because you have so many great ideas, which I will just leave to you. And what I want to talk about is who are discourse researchers. Because, of course, if we want to think about a field, there are some people doing that kind of research. And so it is a very important thing to understand who are the people who are called researchers, who are seen as researchers in that field, and who are also recognized as discourse researchers. And so I thought what I would do is to draw a bit on my work on academic discourse, and also on our work in DiscourseNet, to give you an idea of what, for me and others in our group, has come to be, well, a discourse researcher. And what I will start with is let me just open the presentation. Bagas Leidov. This is probably here, Slajova. And yeah, what I will start with is the many people who have signed up on our DiscourseNet homepage, which is just one group, of course, and there are some others, but I'm sure it's the biggest one and the most international one. DiscourseNet has been active since 2005, 8-ish. It started in Germany, so we had a lot of activity in the German network for the first few years. And we had about 30, I think more than 30 events over the last 12 years. It's become increasingly European. We had different types of events, workshops, congresses, summer schools like here. And yeah, we've had about 6,000 people on the web page. Would you like to? Oh, I should say something about that? Oh, okay. Okay, well, it was a group of people who had met in German conferences, and there was a general feeling that we are all very kind of poor young researchers, totally isolated in our fields, and nobody wanted to talk to us. And so there were these 2, 3, 5 people. There was Martin Onha, for example, who we know, Daniel Vrana, a few others, and we said we need to do something about that across disciplines. And so what we did is we applied for some medium research project, which was called MEMIDA, which is the acronym for methodologies in something discourse analysis. And that was the core, the kind of beginning of a group of people meeting regularly. With the money we got from the German government, we organized quite a number of events, of little workshops. It was just kind of small meetings in Germany. And after a few meetings, we decided to produce 2 major discourse publications. One of them is here. This is the Discourse Handbook, and we try to put everything together which exists in discourse, and I'm sure it's totally complete. And we also produced a dictionary in discourse studies in German as well. And so whoever reads German, I'd very happy to leave it here for you to have a look. And so that was the first kind of phase. When we finished these big projects, which took us a long time, I think this one here took us, 6 years at least, I think 7. We decided to go on, and we started to organize conferences outside Germany. We always had contacts with France and with British colleagues. And so in the first phase, we produced these publications. In the second phase, we organized more international conferences, and it was more like typical normal conference events. And and then we came to Nizhny Novgorod. I think that's it. Is there anything else that comes to your mind? I mean, you as an almost pioneer. Yeah. Yep, that's correct. We all started when we were very at the beginning of our careers. And it was a time in Germany, at least, when discourse drew a lot of interest, but it was definitely not established in any way. I will say a few things about that. And it was definitely not possible to, the funny thing is, it was very clear that people would even say that discourse is a no-go. You shouldn't mention it because, there are all kinds of irrational ideas associated with it. Foucault and things like that. And then over time, what we realized with Discourse Net was, first of all, we are not at all alone. Daniel Vrana programmed the web page. I'm not sure you know about the first version we had until 2 years ago. And all of a sudden we saw, wow, there are thousands of people. It's not just a little bunch of crazy people. And the other thing is we realized it was a new exciting field at the time. And that was, really going well over the next few years. And so, in fact, we were totally able to go on with our research, and we definitely got invested in these questions. And in a way, we helped contribute to establishing this field. And so it was a very good experience to come together and to help each other across the disciplinary boundaries, because of course in each discipline you have a place for one specialist for each little thing, but not for that many others. And so in many cases you need to network across disciplines to really see the many people that work in your area. Okay, so it's got a background. DiscourseNet does not come from nothing. It's been centered in Germany. It was centered in Germany, that's for sure. But this has really opened up a lot over the last few years. And so we had over the time, more than 10,000 registered users, and they definitely came from all over the world. I mean, you could see it on the lists in the webpage. And yeah, what I want to draw on in this presentation is two things. One is a survey I have sent out a few days ago. It's pretty recent. You might have received it. Who received the survey? I mean, basically everybody should have received the survey, so this is slightly unsettling. Okay, interesting. So this is a survey to invite people to give feedback on DiscourseNet, because we've been a very loose network for the last 10 or 15 years. And with all these events going on, we need to become more transparent and more professional. We need to think about some of the resources, and we've decided to become an association, which will be the case in Paris in our big congress, which we are organizing with the Latin American Association, and so we have a big event with 5 language streams: English, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and Russian, and so this Congress in Paris presents in a way the many different strands of discourse research that we see in different languages in the world. And so what I will talk about is the people in this very specific network, which I think could be taken as, to some degree, representative of a global field of discourse studies, and also say something about the different language streams that we see in DiscourseNet. I mean, of course, other groups will show different results. However, I think some of the stuff that you'll see will be quite, I mean, clear about what this field is about. So in the survey, we've had 200 respondents so far. That's a small sample, given that there's 6,000 people on the whole DiscourseNet homepage. And as I realize, most of you didn't even receive it or see it. So we need to resend it, and there will be many more responses. And but I think the very first responses we've got tell us quite a few very, very interesting things about who discourse researchers are. The first result here is the status of the people and I mean, kind of institutional affiliation they have in their universities. And what we see here is there's a quite even distribution among the 3-4 different status groups: junior, mid-career, and senior. Slightly most important group is senior academic, and there's some others. And in fact, this came as a surprise to me, because I expected, first of all, more people who are not academics, and we see it's quite academic group. I mean, most of these people come from universities, and there are quite a few people who are quite established. I thought it was more PhD students and postdocs. So in a way, I think we have a quite clear reflection of the status groups in universities, and discourse studies is a quite academic phenomenon. Well, the next thing is about the disciplinary backgrounds, and people could tick more than one box, so it doesn't add up to 100%. And hardly surprising, linguistics comes first, but it is far from being the only story in town. It's not even half of the people who declare themselves linguists. And we have many other disciplines like sociology, political science, communication science, education. Can you see that? Read it? No, not really. Okay, I read it. So this is linguistics, and it goes up to 44% here. And then there's all kinds of little disciplines: sociology, political science, communication science, education, media studies, philosophy, culture studies, gender studies, literary criticism. So we have linguistics plus, and in many cases, two of them together, right? Because people feel themselves in two disciplines, plus a social science. And in few cases, there are people from humanities, like literary criticism and philosophy. So that's not too surprising, perhaps. We had seen that over the time that there's a dominance of linguists, but it's certainly not the only discipline in discourse studies. Okay, but how do I get to the computer now? But I need to switch the slide. Oh, okay.
Just don't stay near the camera, please.
Okay. Next slide. Then we asked about the country of work of all these people. And what I did here is a mapping of the different backgrounds, the geographical backgrounds. And as you can see, it's a huge mess. I mean, gosh, people come from everywhere. And apart from Germany, which is the superpower in discourse studies, obviously, which is only because it happened to start in Germany, so that there's some sort of over-representation of Germans. You see, it is really kind of all over the place. And but still, you can see some order here. There's a dominance, a clear dominance, even though it's very far from being the only region of the EU zone of influence, let's say. There are surprisingly few Americans. I say that because the United States is by very far, the biggest academic system in the world. So I'm really sure that in most other disciplines, there would be a very strong dominance of North American scholars. And you have people from, I mean, all kinds of different countries outside Europe. Yeah, let me go on to the next slide. Now, this is very interesting because we were talking about language, and that's a very important thing to think about in discourse studies. I asked about the preferred language of work, which doesn't mean that people don't use other languages. It's the preferred language of work, and there can be more than one language. And what you can see here is many people say, a very, very high proportion of the respondents from the survey say the preferred language of work is English, which is almost 80% here. And I did send out the whole thing in several languages. But of course, I mean, and the web page has been in different languages. From the beginning, we had French, German, English. Now we only have English, but that's transitional. We are working on the web page, and there will be many more languages again. We will have at least 5 or 7 more languages. And then if you look for the other languages, there are all kinds of small languages. For example, German, French, all around 20%. And then we have Spanish, just about 10, Russian, 5. Italian, Greek, and then, I mean, all kinds of people who just speak it once, right? So there are all kinds of different other languages which are very kind of individual because nobody else speaks it. And I think what we can take from this here is English is a language of exchange. Because obviously there are many, many more people speaking English and having English as the preferred language of work than there are people from English-speaking countries. If you go back to the slide before, I mean, you see no big dominance of any English-speaking country, right? The United States is small, and the United Kingdom is small, and it's definitely not 80%. So we see that many of these other people from other countries, they use English in their work, and that's quite. I mean, I was really surprised to see that dominance. At the same time, we must never forget that most of these people speak more than one language. So saying that people use English does not mean they don't use other languages. And in fact, I think there are very few monolingual English speakers here in this sample, probably 1 or 2% only. And so this is a situation we really need to reflect on, and it's very important to be aware that we live in a totally multilingual environment here in discourse studies. Okay, let me go to some sort of theoretical considerations. So with these few very first and very preliminary results from the survey, how can we make sense of discourse studies as a global space of knowledge production? And if you have a look at the literature, for example, in the sociology of science, science and technology studies, you have two big ideas of how to represent these spaces of knowledge production. One is, let's say, more hierarchical way of representing a field of researchers, which is the one that comes from Bourdieu. You've heard about Bourdieu, probably. This is from his Homo Academicus. And basically, Bourdieu's idea is researchers have certain socially valuable resources, time especially, but also institutional power, money, family ties, and all that. And these resources allow them to participate in academic research. And some of these people, they will end up at the bottom or at the top, and others at the bottom. And so there's a kind of a battle between all the participants of the academic game over the most valuable positions in the field. And so the idea is you have here a hierarchy between more and less dominant researchers according to the resources they bring into the game, and according to how they can use them in research and in the academic game. And so you have the idea of a big, well, circle in a way, where you can place everybody according to the position in the power game, right? That's one idea, one metaphor in a way, to represent how a field like discourse studies could work. Another field, another idea of how to represent research and the space of knowledge production comes from Latour, Bruno Latour. Have you heard about Latour, perhaps? He is also a French guy, and he's one of the founders of let's say, an ethnographically minded strand in sciences and technology studies. And he coined the idea of networks. So whenever we engage in knowledge production, there are certain elements that are put together in a kind of more or less surprising new creative way. And these networks are not hierarchical. They're decentered, and there are all kinds of heterogeneous things coming together, which make certain things in a way central and important, and give some sort of credence and importance to certain things. So certain claims will become true in research through the practices of all people in a community that engage in this networking of different elements. So in a way, the idea is that research is not a linear process of some people with some sort of talent, and they're going for the most advanced scientific knowledge, and then it's discovered. But research is a kind of random process where all things kind of come together according to whatever conjuncture. And it goes into all directions. It's chaotic, it's creative, and sometimes for very specific reasons in that space, there's certain things that coagulate, and certain things become, in a way, true, established, kind of real knowledge in that field. So this is a very different idea of how research is done, right? It is kind of multiplication of activities according to some very kind of random conjunctures, whereas here in Bourdieu it's very kind of ordered, right? It's clear who you are and what you will be because you have certain resources. And I feel if we want to apply these models to discourse studies, we're somewhere in between. Because what Latour doesn't really want to acknowledge is power, kind of inequality. And obviously in discourse studies we have very, very strong inequalities on a global level, but also within the national realm. So, I mean, that idea from Bourdieu is interesting. However, it is really possible to see discourse studies as that one big box in which everything can be placed, where everybody can really have a relationship with everybody else because everybody understands each other. We need to have this idea of different clusters in a way that coexist and give a very kind of specific structure to discourse studies on that kind of global level. So in thinking about that, I came up with that representation of discourse studies. And let me explain. We have two international brands of discourse studies. I'm not saying these are the most, the biggest groups, but it's certainly the groups which are cited in other languages. And that's the Anglo type of discourse studies. And it's also, to some degree at least, the Franco type of discourse studies. And I call it the Anglosphere for the kind of discourse studies which takes place in the English-speaking world, and Francophonia, which is not an English word, but now it is, and it comes from francophonie, which is the idea that there's a French-speaking sphere of influence or a space where people can communicate through French in the global kind of setting across countries, not only in France, of course, but in many other countries. And so in a way, we have two kind of global languages which have coined very different traditions in discourse studies. And the funny thing is there's almost no exchange between them. It is almost impossible for any French stuff to be taken up in the Anglosphere. And there's some partial reception of English literature in the French sphere. And then we have a second layer of spheres, which are more regional in a way. There are lots of things going on in these different languages, but they're hardly ever taken up in other languages, right? Which is the big difference with the French and especially the English stuff. We have the Lusophone area, which is heavily, of course, dominated by Brazil. We have Spanish stuff, German, Russian, and we have many other things which I have no clue about, but you'll come to Paris and see some of these other people. This is basically what I see in the abstracts that we received for the Paris Congress. And of course, I mean, I also know a few things about one or the other language, and I'll try to give you some background of what I see in these different areas. So what we can see is there are relationships of exchange between these different language areas which are quite unequal. For example, I mean, The Anglosphere, of course, it's the biggest one, and I mean, citing the results before, I mean, most people who cross countries using English as the medium of exchange, I mean, this doesn't really make, this isn't really kind of very surprising. And so whatever is established in the Anglosphere as recognized discourse research has a quite good chance of being taken up in other languages as a reference. And so it's perhaps not a very big surprised to see that there's quite a big influence of the Anglosphere on the 4 languages here on the second level. And this is a very one-sided thing, of course. I mean, some references have been taken up in the Anglosphere, and there are lots of people who enter the Anglosphere from other languages, and over time, through translations of their own works, for example, they become established. I mean, think of Ruth Wodak, for example, who started as an Austrian German-speaking discourse researcher, who's a very established reference in the Anglosphere today. And so, but if we have a look at the relationships between these different spheres, I think it's important to see that they're established channels of communication which are a bit different. I would say, I mean, and this is all quite personal. I mean, I must admit, this is not real research. I mean, not in any way through a survey or something, which is quite interesting perhaps someday to do. What I would guess is there's a very strong influence of English into German, perhaps some from German to English, very little influence from French into German. There's a lot of French influence in the Portuguese area, and as well as English, but perhaps even more French than English, perhaps. And Spanish and Russian, I guess they're typical examples of discourse research fields where there's quite some important reception of English references, and almost no reception whatsoever in the English or the French areas. Now, when I give you this neat picture, I mean, we need to be very careful, of course, because this is very, very simplifying, and I certainly don't want to say that there's some sort of global space of homogeneous questions. What I'm saying here is there's an exchange in terms of references, and references do not mean the same questions, right? You have very different questions and problems in different areas, and you can refer to the same references. That doesn't mean that the questions and what you value as the really interesting stuff is translated. So I guess that the presence of, for example, Anglosphere references in German does not mean that the German sphere is really getting anglicized. I would say it's a very different game, and yeah. The other thing about these top-down representations is they totally forget about the processes behind. There's no such a thing as a kind of constituted system or field where certain things are kind of clearly established one next to the other. But we really need to understand that in each of these spheres, there are certain conjunctures at given moments where big communities start to be excited about certain problems. And it is these big controversies over certain things that establish something like discourse, and also the discourse researchers. And what I will now try to do is to go through the languages and give you an idea of the different careers of discourse as a problem in these different languages. And the idea being is that discourse studies, in a way, if we think of it as a global disciplinary field, it really needs to be seen as the product of all kinds of developments in different languages. And over time, certain references are established as more or less universal across these languages, especially through the Anglosphere, but also through the French sphere. And discourse studies, in a way, need to be seen as a result of these dynamics and processes over time. So we really need to account for the uneven development of discourse studies, and not only in these language spheres, which is what I will talk about now a bit, but also in very different disciplinary and subdisciplinary fields, where you have certain conjunctures like Weaver, whatever, which nobody else knows in other disciplines. But I mean, to establish discourse within IR, that was really kind of the debate which established the whole problem. And this is something that happens in many different fields. That's what I'm trying to get across with this model. So if we start with the establishment of discourse in different language spheres, let me start with Francophonia, which is the most, well, the oldest field where discourse has been discussed. And it goes back to the 1960s, basically, the conjuncture of structuralism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis, the whole theory debate, right, with people like Foucault and Barthes and Deleuze and Lacan. And that was a background for a group of linguists around, for example, Michel Pecheux, to be interested in the way that that certain social political knowledges are established in a national news space, right? For example, I mean, kind of political space, and there are also people like Foucault, who was a more solitary intellectual, who did a lot to put discourse as an intellectual problem on the agenda of the day. And so we have a certain kind of tradition of formal linguistics, especially if we think of the group around Pecheux, who is the founder of the French school of discourse analysis. And people used formal linguistics, that is Saussure, for example, distributionalism, which is inspired by Zelig Harris, which is, do you know Zelig Harris? Zelig Harris is the teacher of Noam Chomsky's, and he had the vision of discourse analysis in the 50s. And in fact, it was an article called Discourse Analysis, which was published in 52, which was then translated into French, which gave the field its name. People took it up in French and then started to talk about discourse analysis to understand the construction of order beyond the sentence level. I mean, the traditional objective of linguists at that time was to understand how sentences were formed, and sometimes words. And with Harris and his article on discourse analysis, people started to see that there must be something like order beyond the sentence. Wow. And that led to the whole question of, I mean, many sentences, discourses being embedded in society and kind of being part of a culture and all that. And so this is basically how formal linguists, who had very analytical, very sometimes mechanical methods of accounting for language. I mean, I'm saying mechanical because they were not interested at the beginning in meaning. That was a very kind of formal approach to language. They took up these analytical formalist methods in order to go further up to the social level, to the level of many texts together, and to understand the order of discourse, well, in a whole language community. And I guess, I mean, you heard mostly about Foucault, who is a totally canonized figure today in the social sciences and humanities. And what people don't know outside the Francophonia is that, in fact, the school of discourse analysts in France, they formed around Pecheux, who was the more linguistic-oriented discourse analyst he was also quite intellectual. He was a philosopher, but he wasn't as sensationalized as Foucault was, as a kind of public figure and a kind of, I mean, he wasn't a systematic discourse analyst at all, of course, and in a way, these two people gave the kind of impetus. They triggered the whole debate about discourse in France, and this had extremely important effects in the long term on many people working on language and society. There were, of course, different generations. Discourse analysis in France has become more systematic and more empirical, I would say, over time. These more theoretical speculations of the first year are less common today. You don't see many people who even know about these theoretical backgrounds of the 60s and 70s today in France. And we also need to point out that, of course, these early theoretical things that are today no longer that important in France, they keep on living in other language spheres, especially in the Anglosphere, where there's a whole debate around discourse theory, especially in the social sciences in Europe, and also in Latin America. And so we have different generations taking up this early controversy, which was very kind of powerful. It was a very small group, but it's got very long-term effects and has, in a way, influenced generations of different people, sometimes with much more empirical interests, like nowadays in France, and sometimes with very theoretical interests, like in the Anglosphere, and sometimes both of them in Latin America. So this is how discourse has become established in Francophonia. I would say it is important that Francophonia discourse analysis is very much centered in Paris. Even in France, there are many other groups work on very similar questions who never really got the recognition that they perhaps should have deserved. But we see there are certain dynamics which channel the attention to always very specific groups and people. And as a result of these dynamics, there are at least two figures who really became canonicized in Francophonia discourse studies, which is Foucault and Pécheux. And this is not only true, of course, for the French-speaking discourse on discourse, but also for other languages. Okay. This is very, very fast. It is very incomplete, and it's very personal. If you have any questions, that's very much welcome. Yeah.
And he always appears in this context of Marxist discussion. Is there a distinction of Anglosphere between the Marxist philosophers and the discourse researchers?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a spontaneous answer, perhaps. What you could really see, there was a very active translation industry in the 70s up to the early 80s of Marxist theorists all over the world. Marxist, I think it's because there were many people willing to translate these works for free, and there was a kind of commitment that pushed them to translate these things. So I guess that Pécheux was translated in, I mean, the major thing in 75 as a kind of aspect of this whole process of translation of international Marxist theory. And honestly, I'm not sure to what degree Pécheux has really been taken up outside the Francophonia, except for Brazil, where there's a whole school of Pécheuians. I think it is quite difficult for people to understand what this is about in English. If you think of a work like automatic discourse analysis, which is the pioneering work, together with Foucault's archaeology, perhaps, and that pioneering work is something that is incomprehensible because it comes across as a very mathematical kind of approach, and it should be understood much more metaphorical, I guess, as the idea that we can find some algorithms to account for discourse on a big level, which is an idea which powered some of the early inspirations of discourse analysts, who then became interested in lexicometrics. But that idea never really kind of materialized. It's a vision that was a dead end, in my view, and so the practice of Pechau's discourse analysis has never been translated. That's a practice with working on texts, which is dispersed in all kinds of French journal articles, which you won't find in that book. And then there's the theory book, which has been translated, and theory is always much more easy to translate than the practice, the analytical practice. And the theory book, I think, has been taken note of, but without the practice around it, it never really kind of got the big kind of prominence that others got outside France. And the French Pechauian discourse analysis is very much about the practice of accounting for the materiality of discourse, that is, for the way that forms organize and determine the production of meaning. And that's something which you don't find in these translated books. And yeah, that's why he was very likely much more received as a Marxist theorist than as a discourse theorist. Just, I mean, my, say, gut reaction here. Yes. Yeah.
Well, in fact, they wrote on and moved rights also in French. Why did you do it in the first place?
Well, I'm sure Mouffe wrote a bit in French, but I mean, Laclos came to the UK in the 60s from Argentina. He kept close contacts with Argentina, and I think he even ended up as ambassador or something in France. Oh, there was a discussion. Yeah, at the end of his life, the Kirchners wanted him to make ambassador in France, which was quite an interesting idea, and I think it never materialized. So it's true. I mean, he's not an all English person, but he's definitely somebody who's had his career in the Anglosphere. He was a professor at Essex. Mouffe came from Belgium, and she worked with him right from the beginning, kind of duo together. And so even though they drew from all these kind of backgrounds, and you see a very strong background of the Peronist political culture in Laclau, for example, you see a very strong background of the French philosophical culture in both of them, in fact. It is definitely something which was from the beginning an Anglosphere project. Up to this day, Laclau and Mouffe have never been really received in France. They're not references that you know about in France. I mean, it might be changing a bit, but if it's changing, it's just the last 2 or 3 years. And so you ask almost anybody in France, and they would know nothing about them. Whereas in political science, in Europe, in the Anglosphere, everybody will know them. Should I go on? How much time do I have? We have enough time? Oh, that's dangerous. Okay, let me get to the next conjuncture that established something. And I want to mention something which we easily forget because it's so big and so common, at least in the social sciences, that we just take it for granted. At the same time as in France, there were some people being interested in formal linguistics and discourse. We have people in sociology in North America who are interested in everyday practices, symbolic interactionism. I mean, I call it here the sociology of everyday practices in order not to take this very limiting label of symbolic interactionism, which I think you would just associate with certain people. And this, of course, is the outcome of a big controversy over positivism in the social sciences. There was a big turn against the natural sciences model. There was the controversy over positivism in Germany, especially with Adorno and Popper and these people. And in the US, there was a big turn towards the actor, to reclaim the expertise of the experts who are not the scientists, to give a voice to the people from the life worlds, from the social contexts under study. And so there's a whole movement since that time, in the 70s, towards qualitative methods which give a voice to the actors and their practices. And so the researcher is no longer testing certain hypotheses, kind of top-down, and uncovering certain correlations and variables and causalism and all that. The researcher becomes a very kind of humble observer who tries to understand how people do it when they talk on the street at the bus stop, how people do the health counseling service when they need some help, and all kinds of things like that. That is a debate which is today known as qualitative social research, and I think you don't really think about of it in terms of discourse. I mention it because it is so important as a background of so much discourse research, and it's sometimes overlooked that language plays a very important role here. If you have a look at the key figures which as a result of these conjunctures have been established as canonical authorities in that field, Goffman has worked on framing the way that the different speaking instances are mobilized whenever talk is performed. I mean, the whole project of conversation analysis, which comes from ethnomethodology initially, Garfinkel and especially his disciple Sachs, deals with language as a turn-taking process. There's Ciccarel, who founded the American sociology of language. That is the kind of idea of language as a social practice. There's also the Fishman sociology of language, which one could mention as well, which is more about language policy, a different kind of language idea. Then you have Gumpertz, who is kind of conversation analyst, and Himes, the anthropology of communication. He's not an interactionist. He's much more about culture and the way how to account for meaning making as part of a more holistic cultural sphere. And you have maverick figures perhaps like Bateson and so on and so forth. I mention this because discourse is very, very present, even though the term discourse is hardly ever used. The term discourse was quite prominent in very limited, one or two very limited subdisciplinary fields, which is sociolinguistics. And you see, for example, Gumpertz, who is a social linguist. He used discourse right from the beginning to designate conversation, right? So this is the kind of North American understanding of discourse as conversation. And this is, of course, something which is quite different from the continental understanding of discourse, which is much more about corpora, texts, written discourse, and therefore people in Europe didn't really kind of explicitly refer to these people here, and But I think what we saw here, there was a conjuncture around 1970, an explosion of interest, big kind of very acrimonious debates about the limits of existing models of research. And as a result, there's this kind of qualitative approach to language and society that has been established. Now, this is very much centered in North America and has been totally taken up all over the world, in especially sociology, but the adjacent disciplines as well. And what I would now come to is the stuff that is more specifically discourse, and which we now associate with critical discourse analysis, which came in much later. Critical discourse analysis started, I'd say, at the earliest in 1990, when Norman Fairclough produced that book on discourse and social change, 89 or something, or 92. And this is also part of a major controversy in linguistics, not sociology. I mean, this is very much centered in linguistics. And which was in Europe especially, not in the US, about the limits of traditional theoretical linguistics. Now, what is theoretical linguistics? Theoretical linguistics is basically Chomsky and Saussure. That is, the major pioneers of linguistics as a discipline who believed in language as an object in itself, kind of closed, as it were, from the wider social context. For Chomsky and Saussure, you can account for language as a kind of closed system of mechanisms, rules, elements that are put together in a way to produce language, expressions, sentences, and all that. And in Europe, that was totally foundational for linguistics, and that has come under attack. And critical discourse analysis is one of the symptoms of that crisis of theoretical linguistics. And people like Norman Fairclough, Van Dijk, and Wodak, they reminded us of the social and political dimensions, the relevance of social problems, the major kind of bigger, broader social context, and all that. Methods are very much focused on document and text analysis, especially written text analysis, but it's extremely eclectic. We can't really see very easily kind of common theoretical thread or orientation, and what you can really see is a focus on certain topics, and the topics is the discrimination of social groups, and that is especially something against the rise of xenophobia in Europe since the 70s, which is something that for some reason goes on still today. And we need to point out not only the UK Commonwealth world as one center of that kind of debate, but also Germany. In fact, it was German discourse analysts from the 70s and 80s who founded critical discourse analysis. But that has never been known because they're German. And so we had this conjuncture which put discourse on the map, and we can say today there were so many people, and there have been so many people engaging in these questions, that we can understand CDA as a subfield, as a disciplinary subfield within linguistics to some degree. Now, if we go on to the smaller languages, like Germany, I mentioned that in fact it was a German discourse analyst who coined the term critical discourse analysis, and I think that was even as far as back to the late 70s. Siegfried Jäger, who in a way had a very similar debate around the limits of theoretical linguistics in Germany. A very, very controversial figure for many other linguists, because he had the tendency of denouncing the racism anti-Semitism of his colleagues, which they obviously didn't appreciate too much. What needs to be pointed out here in the German context is it's not only one big controversy around discourse that has been important to define the term, but many. And that's the problem. That was the problem in Germany for a long time. There were too many controversies around discourse. So people didn't really know what people referred to when they heard about discourse. And just to give you 3 or 4 of these controversies in Germany, around 1980, there is, of course, Habermas, who was a very prominent intellectual public figure, and who created discourse ethics as a 3rd-generation project for critical theory in Germany. And so discourse had always been very, very strong overtones with that kind of social philosophy that we know from Habermas, which is quite different in tone and in substance from critical discourse analysis. It's much more epistemological. It is much more about abstract philosophical ideas like what are the foundations of criticism in society, and not at all about empirical analysis of certain discourses. The idea being is what is important is the deliberation about social problems as a major kind of dimension of the making of society. So people need, and they do, deliberate about political problems, and the question is what are the rules, the kind of norms and the values they mobilize in order to come to an agreement. I mentioned Jäger and his friend Jürgen Link as pioneers within linguistics, and for a long time this is the kind of German critical discourse analysis which was quite established within that area, not so much in other social sciences. Wodak came later. She started to become active as a critical German, Austrian discourse analyst in the late mid-90s. And she then moved to the UK, and basically, I mean, she needs to be seen as a kind of Anglosphere phenomenon in discourse studies, I guess, because I mean, her prominence in the Anglosphere is so overwhelming today that yeah, she's not seen as a real kind of German kind of product. Yeah, and then what happened is, I mean, there are many other debates around discourse. There's some feminist debate around Butler, for example, which was very important. There's also some Derridian discourse stuff and in the humanities, and then what happened is, oh, this is wrong. This needs to read 2000. Since the 2000s, there has been a turn towards Foucault as a canonical figure in all kinds of disciplines, as a kind of new theoretical socio-cultural theorist of power and knowledge. And basically it is the reception of Foucault through the Anglosphere. He was received at that point through the Anglosphere, not from Francophonia. That Foucault really kind of came to dominate the whole debate on discourse. And if people today talk about discourse, they know, oh yeah, it's the whole planet Foucault basically we're referring to. And that has really kind of allowed people to start to position themselves as discourse researchers and to work in that field. Yeah, and basically he came after Habermas left the scene, and allowed people to become more historical, more empirical in their orientations than these earlier philosophers who were very, very theoretical. Okay, so in Germany we have a great richness of disciplinary backgrounds. We have some striking themes, and of course there are many, 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 many more. I mean, there's of course a strong interest in everything coming from the Nazi period up to anti-Semitism, up to new social movements, very important, especially for the kind of Habermasian discourse stuff. And Yeah, so in a way, I think Germany, in a way, is probably typical for languages where you see a certain hub between, I mean, the receptions from the Francophonia and the Anglosphere, and within a sphere like Germany, these things meet. Even though it needs to be pointed out that unlike other countries, for example, Scandinavia, the region of Scandinavia, and perhaps the Benelux, after the 2000s, there were very few people who really followed the French debates directly. What they did is they took over the references from the Anglosphere, and so they waited for these other guys to be translated into English in order to recognize them in German. And up to the 2000s, there were still some people who followed the French debates directly, and unfortunately, this has stopped a bit, and the problem also was that these earlier people, for some reason, they never really established themselves in German academia, and whereas these people working with Anglosphere references, they were much more successful with their academic careers, which I think is interesting, and we'll get back to that. There are no other questions. I go on to the next one. The Lusophone discourse research. Now, this is probably that nobody has ever heard about here. Does anybody speak Portuguese? No. Okay. Good. So I can say I speak Portuguese. That's great. What we can see in the Lusophone discourse research is a very strong dominance of Brazil, which is quite normal given the quantitative dominance of Brazil in the Portuguese language area. Brazil is an enormous country of today more than 200 million people, and there has been a very, very, very active debate about discourse for a long time. And from the early 1980s, there has been a very direct translation of French references and French debates into the Brazilian context. And what we've seen is the foundation of various schools along these different receptions. And one can mention, for example, materialist discourse analysis, dialogical, enunciative, Foucauldian, psychoanalytical, which is all French. Right. One can also point out, I mean, some chapels, some sort of little groups around certain figures like Courtine, and a bit later, I would say only about 10 years ago, CDA became important as a reference for people. The background is usually in linguistics, kind of philological linguistics. There's very little discourse research that connects with the social sciences in Brazil. So in a way, it is very close to the French context, where discourse is very clearly placed within linguistics as a formal letters-oriented discipline, right? Which is different, and that's very important in terms of these receptions from the Anglo-Saxon world, where linguistics can also be in the social sciences. So France and also to some degree Germany and Brazil have traditions of linguistics as philology. Which means there's a certain proximity towards the French debate, which is much more focused on the kind of formal models of analysis of language that has come from Saussure, for example, and things like that. So there are lots of different topics, of course, of study, and as in any other language that we've seen so far, there's a great deal of interest in political discourse, especially over the last few years with Dilma Rousseff and Lula and Bolsonaro today. These are industries of empirical discourse research that have been established over time. And what I also wanted to point out is that in the Brazilian context, there's a great deal of theoretical interest. So these schools are really integrated around a very clearly defined set of theoretical axioms. And so there's a certain investment in these theoretical questions, which one doesn't see that much, for example, in the Anglosphere world, like CDA, for example. I mean, theoretical kind of questions are much more open and a bit more arbitrary. And in the Brazilian context, you see a quite clearly established number of key figures, almost canonicized figures in that context, Olonji, Bechibraj, Bosenchi, and they represent these different schools that have been received, that have been created as a reception phenomenon from Europe. And I'm not sure about CDA, whether there's a key figure, but what you can see is they're not only controversies around discourse, and discourse is then established as an important and valuable term in that debate, but there are also key figures which emerge as the kind of recognized figures. Okay, anything else? Now I come to the stuff I know a bit less. Spanish language. Para los hispanohablantes. ¿Quiénes son los hispanohablantes aquí? Dos? Okay. Now, there's a very great deal of interest in discourse research in the Spanish-speaking world, from Spain to Latin America. And I mean, the problem I have, and it might be because I have never really been able to follow this systematically, it seems to me that unlike the other language areas that I just talked about, the Spanish language discourse research takes place in a language sphere which is less integrated than the others. I don't have the feeling that you have a kind of overall space of communication where people really perceive each other as participants of the same game. So it is a more local business, perhaps, where you certainly see a lot of theoretical influences from CDA and French DA, with lots of national and regional varieties. I mean, for example, in Argentina, there's a tradition of rhetorics, which is almost a synonym, I guess, for discourse research. Even though I think that rhetorics is a bit more philosophical than the kind of CDA stuff, because of ideas of universal norms of good talking. In Argentina as well, there's a great deal of interest in psychoanalysis, which has come from Europe, especially through Lacan. And so, I mean, in Mexico, you have people working on complexity theory, Morin. In Spain, you have some sociologists who were interested in discourse, Ibanez, for example. And usually there's not that much kind of cross-country exchange in my impression. I mean, correct me if you have a very different impression. You're definitely much more an expert than I am. And so linguistics is certainly important, but sometimes it seems that the local configurations are more important to explain why people get into discourse or not. And so we have also some other disciplines like the social sciences. And what strikes me, and that's something I saw when we went through the abstracts for the Discourse Congress in Paris, there's a great deal of interest in more local questions, and questions like inequality and discrimination as a kind of pressing problem for activists. And it seems a bit less theoretical in orientation than, for example, the stuff that one can see in Brazil. And yeah, I'm not aware of key figures. I mean, a clearly recognized phalanx, a kind of hit parade of the major discourse theorists in the Spanish-speaking world. I mean, perhaps we kind of debate. Can you? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. I mean, at any rate, I mean, the Spanish-speaking sphere is a huge sphere with very different academic systems behind. So the other spheres are all kind of dominated by one academic system, which is not at all true for the Spanish-speaking world, where you also have quite different publishing houses. I mean, publishing in Spanish is so difficult because of no common space, and so I think that also adds to my impression that it's that you need to kind of start from the local kind of configurations to understand what's going on, and then try to go from one local to the next local kind of country or kind of town. Okay. Very shocking what I said. I mean, it's an attempt to talk about these things and to put some kind of very preliminary words on these very different situations that we have. So the last thing, Russian language discourse here. Now this is a really difficult thing for me, and I'm almost embarrassed to talk about this here. I mean, there's a very strong international influence of certain references, especially Bakhtin, who is a maverick kind of cultural, social, whatever, theorist, analyst from the 20th century. And he's a slightly mythical figure for questions of authorship. And he's sometimes also associated, even so totally wrongly, with the Marxism of Language book by Voloshinov. But he's kind of seen as part of a circle of these different theorists. And perhaps there's also some proximity with Lotman and the cultural semiotics tradition because of a common interest in the Saussurean model as a model for the analysis of culture, more broadly understood. So what strikes me, and I can just say what strikes me about some of the Russian debates, is there's always been a very strong interest in culture as a holistic system that is a kind of top-level configuration of meaning that is sometimes called culture. And I remember when I was in Petersburg in the 90s, I had a look at stuff from the Soviet period, which was called Kulturologia. Does that exist? Yeah. And so there were people like Bromley, kind of studying the rise and fall of cultures. And I think you still have culturology. I was really hesitating about the translation of that word because I wouldn't say it's cultural studies. And it is more, I think, probably closer to some sort of, I mean, national kind of study of folklore. Could you say so? I mean, the kind of idea of national cultures and civilizations. What strikes me in Russia is, of course, there's a great deal of influence from the outside world and lots of references from the Anglosphere. There are lots of local interests in these questions of culture. one approach that I sometimes see is a civilizational approach to culture as a kind of study of the making over long times, right, long historical times of meaning-making systems, and Lotman is perhaps one of them, but there are also others who look a bit more essentializing in the approach to culture, perhaps. And another thing which I think is new, which I see only in the last few years, is people who defend a patriotic approach to culture and discourse, and they're interested in the question of nation and statehood, and the question of national kind of power and all that, and that's really something which I never see anywhere else. I mean, the kind of patriotic idea of science is something which is probably very kind of specific for nowadays Russia, if that can be counted as research, which we might have a debate about. I cite these key figures, which are international references. I have no idea at all about the Russian debate and the kind of key figures that within the Russian language sphere are established, and yeah, we should have a discussion about that. And yeah. Does that make sense? Food for thought? Absurd? No? Yes? Probably a bit. I mean, it's... Yeah, well, okay. I knew it. Okay, good. I'm not gonna publish this, okay? I mean... Oh. Let me wrap up some of the ideas and the thoughts that I tried to come up with. And I wasn't really making the point that any kind of discourse debate in any language, including Russian, is that or that, because there's just so much around, and nobody, and especially not I, can really have a good overview of everything. And I leave it to you. You are the experts of your discourse references, and you're much better experts at that. And what I want to come up with at the end here is to get a sense for the kind of processes, the dynamics in different specific fields in the world, in different disciplines, that over time have established discourse as an established research problematic. And that's something where certain national or linguistic backgrounds need to be accounted for. It's not a big space where everything is in touch with everything else. It's certainly not a big space where everything is on the same par. It's a very unequal space. And what we need to point out is the hyper unequal distribution of visibility of the people who take part in these discourses about discourse. And first of all, I mean, if you have a look at these controversies and these conjunctures about discourse in the different language spheres, you see this kind of sudden excitement about something, right? And all of a sudden, everybody talks about Habermas' discourse ethics, right? And what happens is not only that discourse becomes established, but also Habermas becomes a very much cited, a very recognized figure in the debate. And he becomes unavoidable. I mean, you have to cite the person. And you don't even have to read Habermas anymore in order to be part of the game, because it's important to cite these people in order to be part of the game. And that is a very important effect of these debates in large communities. The attention is focused on a very, very small group of people who almost monopolize the whole attention of everybody else who's never cited or heard in the field. So we have within these language spheres, which sometimes coincide with academic systems to some degree, you have very strong inequalities which are made over time. So they're the superstars who become the kind of representative of the new field that is instituted thanks to this controversy. You have lots of people who take part in these controversies and then get the recognition to move on in their careers and become senior professors, whatever, blah. And then you have many people who are not recognized. So they're not part of the community and they cannot really move on in that national academic system. Now, that's of course something that is very different according to the type of language sphere and the academic system behind. In Germany, of course, as well as in France, the debate is so much centered on Germany and France, so that the recognition that you get within the language sphere basically reflects to some degree the reputation within the academic system. So people can translate that reputation into careers to some degree, right? That's very different in the Anglosphere, which is not at all replicating an academic system, even though it is always interesting to see the big differences, the invisible borders between the Northern American and the European English debates. Now, that's, of course, one thing to reflect on our position as participants of a game who have some stakes within the institutions, within these communities, within the debates, and who also need jobs and kind of need a minimum of recognition just to go on with our research. Because if you don't get at least a small job, I mean, how do you really become a discourse researcher in the long time? But the other thing we also need to reflect on are the hierarchies between language spheres. Because obviously, if there's some systematic filters between languages, not everybody can take part in these global debates around discourse at all. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the possibilities for careers, again, in different languages. It has a lot to do with English being the lingua franca between countries today, especially in some countries, Europe, Asia, perhaps. And yeah, so, I mean, people know from experience that in order to kind of leave a trace and make an impression, not every position allows you to do so. And that is, I think, something we definitely need to reflect on. And people do that. People are very much aware of these inequalities within the global scientific system. And they're basically two spontaneous reactions which people come up with in order to react to this unfairness, which I think everybody sees as unfairness, because people understand it's not just about the talent of those who happen to be cited very often, but it's very much about these structures within the academic systems and the global scientific system. One reaction is to let's do away with that global imperialism, right? And what we see is a strong resistance against the idea that there is a global system of inequality through English, and a whole institutional dispositive, journals and kind of practices of evaluations, benchmarking and all that. And there's a very legitimate criticism of that kind of imperialist approach to science and to accounting for the quality of research, that claims some universal worldwide standards, and of course there are some groups within all kinds of different languages and academic systems who are pushing for this kind of globalization of standards, and that of course is cited as good or as bad by different actors in these different contexts. So that's one reaction, right? Let's get away with imperialism. The other reaction is let's get away, let's get out nativism, right? What are the nativists? And the nativists are also a very kind of important strand of people with their place in that space. The nativists are those who have their local power base somewhere, and usually their influence goes no further than the national sphere. They rely on kind of personal networks. They mobilize certain kind of strategies which are not really based on publications. It depends. I mean, it happens they're not as visible as certain other people in discourse research, and so the nativists, they claim the quality of the more local knowledge. And they claim that our science needs to protect it from that science, which is kind of global thing, and that's also very legitimate, because I mean, of course, all these knowledges, they emerge from very specific, very local backgrounds, and there's no universal science. It is a very kind of grounded practice, and in a way, I think we need to go beyond both, right? Let's be dialectic here and go for a cosmopolitan approach, which totally recognizes that there's a falseness of this discussion about global, worldwide standards of excellence, right? That doesn't exist. That's wrong, and it masks and it hides some very particular interests that is from a very particular language background with a very particular linguistic expertise, and they use that kind of false discourse about global standards in order to push their agenda. So for cosmopolitans, this is really kind of something unacceptable, but it's also totally unacceptable to kind of fall back into this very closed cushion kind of nest of local references where people are cited not only because people think this is interesting, but I mean, there are these kind of strategic things which translate personal relationships in a way, and this kind of power game is something that can be quite unsatisfying, of course. And so, for a cosmopolitan academic practice, the point is to kind of do discourse research that makes sense, that recognizes your kind of local backgrounds without compromising on the quality and the excitement that you have for your ideas, and that connects with the various approaches across languages, and it is able to translate the local knowledges from your discourse research into something more kind of, let's say, transnational. So it's not only kind of understandable and receivable in one local context. Now that sounds perhaps a bit abstract, and I want to finish with some very concrete advice. The advice is 4 points. First of all, don't worship totemic figures. I mean, if you haven't read somebody, don't cite the person because you think that's somebody to be cited. That's boring, and people, I mean, they don't want to see just another citation of, I don't know, Fairclough or whoever who you haven't read. So cite the stuff that you care about, and that you can explain why you care about. And the other thing is, never cite Anglosphere stuff only. Nobody here is a monolingual English speaker. It doesn't make sense. If you do that, you contribute to sort of artificial academic knowledge that tries to conform to pseudo global standard of academic excellence, which doesn't exist. What is really important is to make visible the diversity of backgrounds that we all have. And we want to learn not only about the 50,000 citation of whatever, we want to learn about your local background and how it relates to global things. That's a cosmopolitan practice in academia, right? So if you can translate that knowledge into something which can be received by other people, that would be really, really interesting. Next point, engage with the controversies. Try to understand the big questions and relate to them. Don't get bogged down or kind of narrowed down in little over-specialized questions which are devoid of any sense. It is very easy to kind of lock oneself into a very disciplinary, very specialized pseudo question that nobody else outside understands. If you work on questions that only two other people understand, I think I would be a bit careful, even though if that's one of the things that you do, I think that's very good, because you don't want to be understood by everybody. But the big question should be something that other people should be able to relate to. So what I sometimes see is people come from a very small field. I mean, this is a total random example, conversation analysis, for example, and then they come with this idea that, oh, this is the kind of way that scientific research is done. We analyze the turn taking, and I do it in my work, and that's scientific. Now, this is the kind of recipe stuff that is really kind of strange, because, I mean, there's no ultimate truth. I mean, if that's the case, either you would already have the Nobel Prize, or I mean, others would have had it. So, I mean, it's more likely that others would have had the Nobel Prize for that ultimate truth from conversation analysis. So, don't replicate any recipe answer within the discipline or outside. It doesn't really excite anybody. It is very dry and boring. And try to relate to something exciting new through focusing on the big question. Try to get a sense of the big, powerful questions that have really driven big communities. And there are not that many, I can tell you. I mean, there are not that many big, powerful questions that are really kind of exciting people. And the last, almost the last thing here, get out of your academic bubble. I mean, this all looks very academic, and it is, and I mean, that's how specialized knowledge production works. But if there's another Nazi idiot running your country, that's a problem too. And we care about it, and you care about it. And do get engaged with these non-academic things, right? We live in a society which we are citizens as academics, and we can't do academic research without being aware of our broader social position. And of course, it makes a huge difference to work in a system, in a country, where we can say things as academics or not. And I mean, DiscourseNet happens to have had the last 4 events in Hungary, Italy, the UK, and now in Russia. And this happens to be the countries with the most horrible nationalist leaders. And this is something we can't be indifferent to. And we need to work on our position as discourse researchers in the social space as well. So at any rate, it all boils down to do stuff that rocks, and let's go for it.